You know what's strange about Rodney Dangerfield? For a man who built an empire by telling the world he got no respect, he may have been one of the most beloved entertainers America ever produced. Audiences laughed the second he stepped onto a stage. Johnny Carson practically treated him like royalty. Other comedians worshipped him. Yet behind the sweating forehead, the bugged-out eyes, and the famous red tie was a man who spent almost his entire life feeling abandoned, unwanted, and emotionally broken. And maybe that's why people connected to him so deeply. Because Rodney Dangerfield never sounded like a polished Hollywood star. He sounded like a man desperately trying to laugh through the pain. By the end of his life, the public saw a comedy legend. But very few people knew just how dark his journey really was. Behind the jokes were years of poverty, emotional neglect, depression, scandal, addiction, legal trouble, heartbreak, and a lifetime of trying to outrun the feeling that he simply wasn't enough. Even more incredible, he somehow turned all of it into comedy. But the most haunting chapter of Rodney's story may have happened at the very end. In a hospital room, surrounded by failing health and the reality that his time was running out, Rodney still found a way to crack jokes. Even then, he refused to stop performing. It was as if comedy had become more than a career. It was survival. And to understand why Rodney Dangerfield became the man he was, you have to go all the way back to the lonely little boy who never felt seen in the first place. Long before the world knew him as Rodney Dangerfield, he was Jacob Cohen, born in 1921 in Babylon, New York. His childhood was nothing like the glamorous stories people imagine when they think about future celebrities. There was no loving household, no warm support system, no encouraging parents telling him to chase his dreams. What he had instead was absence. His father, Phil Roy, was a vaudeville performer who spent most of his time away from home. Rodney later claimed he only saw him a couple of times a year. His mother, Dorothy, was emotionally distant, cold, and overwhelmed by poverty. The household felt less like a family and more like strangers trapped together under one roof. For a sensitive child, that kind of emotional emptiness leaves scars. Rodney would later joke endlessly about rejection and disrespect, but those jokes weren't invented out of nowhere. They came from real experiences, real loneliness, real pain. The Great Depression only made life harder. Money was scarce. Rodney worked odd jobs while still young just to help survive. While other children worried about school or games, he was learning how cruel life could be. And then came one of the most disturbing stories he ever shared publicly. In his autobiography, Rodney described wandering the streets alone when he was just 5 years old. A man approached him and offered him a nickel to sit on his lap. To a lonely, hungry child during the Depression, a nickel felt enormous. Rodney accepted, not fully understanding what was happening. The man kissed and touched him while the boy sat there confused. What makes the story even more heartbreaking is that Rodney returned multiple times because he needed the money and had nobody protecting him. Years later, Rodney turned that horrifying memory into one of his dark jokes, calling himself a male hooker at age 5. Audiences laughed. That was Rodney's gift. He could turn trauma into punchlines. But underneath the humor was something devastating. He once ended the story with a bitter line aimed at his mother. "Thanks for looking after me, Ma." That sentence tells you almost everything about Rodney Dangerfield's life. He grew up believing he didn't matter. And somehow, instead of becoming bitter beyond repair, he transformed that pain into comedy that millions of people related to. But success didn't come quickly. In fact, for a very long time, Rodney looked like a complete failure. As a teenager, Jacob Cohen already loved writing jokes. By 15, he was selling material to comedians. He believed entertainment would eventually save him. So at 19, he reinvented himself under a new stage name, Jack Roy. It sounded flashy, confident, like somebody destined for stardom. But the comedy world barely noticed him. For years, he struggled through humiliating gigs and tiny clubs. He worked as a singing waiter. He bombed on stage constantly. He bounced between jobs while trying desperately to support a wife and family. Eventually, reality crushed him. He quit comedy entirely. Rodney later joked that when he left show business, "I was the only one who knew I quit." That line became legendary because it perfectly captured the sadness hidden inside his humor. While audiences laughed at the self-deprecation, Rodney was revealing something painfully true. He genuinely felt invisible. To survive, he started selling aluminum siding. Imagine that for a moment. One of the greatest comedians in history walking door to door trying to sell home repairs because his dream had completely collapsed. Most people would have stayed defeated. Rodney couldn't. Even while working regular jobs, something kept pulling him back toward the stage. The hunger never left him. By the early 1960s, he decided to try one final comeback. But there was a problem. Jack Roy had already failed. Nobody cared about Jack Roy anymore. So he reinvented himself again. One night, while preparing for a performance at a small club, he asked the owner for a new name because he didn't want people recognizing him from his earlier failures. The owner randomly suggested Rodney Dangerfield, a name previously used in old comedy programs. Rodney hated it at first, but that accidental name change ended up creating a legend. More importantly, Rodney finally discovered the secret that made him unique. Instead of trying to appear smooth, confident, or charming like other comedians, he leaned directly into failure. He became the guy nobody respected, the guy whose wife hated him, the guy with bad luck, the guy life constantly humiliated, and audiences instantly connected with it, because underneath the jokes was honesty. In 1967, Rodney appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and suddenly everything changed. Viewers exploded with laughter. They didn't just hear jokes. They recognized themselves in him. The insecurity, the rejection, the frustration. Rodney made ordinary people feel seen. Soon, he became a regular face in American entertainment. Las Vegas loved him. Television loved him. And perhaps nobody embraced Rodney more than Johnny Carson. Carson understood instantly how special he was. Over the years, Rodney appeared on The Tonight Show more than 70 times. Every appearance felt electric because Carson played the perfect straight man to Rodney's chaos. The chemistry between them became legendary. Rodney would walk out sweating and nervous-looking, tugging at his tie while delivering rapid-fire one-liners about his miserable life. "I tell ya, I get no respect." The audience would erupt before he even finished the sentence. But while fame finally arrived, Rodney's emotional wounds never disappeared. That's the tragic thing about childhood trauma. Success doesn't magically erase it. Even as Rodney became one of the biggest comedians alive, there was still a part of him that felt abandoned. And in many ways, his entire career became a desperate attempt to finally earn the love and validation he missed as a child. By the 1980s, Rodney Dangerfield was everywhere. His role in Caddyshack transformed him into a movie star almost overnight. Playing the loud, obnoxious Al Chervik, Rodney stole scenes from comedy giants like Chevy Chase and Bill Murray. Much of his dialogue was improvised, which frustrated some cast members because audiences couldn't stop laughing at him. The former failed salesman was now dominating Hollywood. Movies like Easy Money and Back to School cemented his popularity even further. Interestingly, his film characters often flipped his stage persona upside down. On stage, Rodney was the pathetic loser. In movies, he frequently played lovable underdogs who outsmarted arrogant rich people and won everybody over. Audiences loved seeing him succeed. And despite his fame, Rodney never forgot how painful the climb had been. That's one reason younger comedians adored him. He became known for helping struggling performers, especially comedians nobody else believed in yet. One of those comics was a young Jim Carrey. After seeing Carrey perform, Rodney hired him as an opening act in Las Vegas and mentored him for years. Long before Hollywood recognized Jim Carrey's brilliance, Rodney saw it immediately. Years later, Carrey surprised Rodney at his 80th birthday party just to thank him personally. That moment meant everything to Rodney because deep down, he never forgot what it felt like to be ignored. But while his career flourished publicly, his personal life remained deeply complicated. Rodney's first marriage to Joyce Indig was filled with turbulence. In many ways, it mirrored the instability he experienced growing up. They married in 1949 after both stepping away from entertainment careers in search of a normal life. But normalcy never really fit Rodney Dangerfield. The relationship became an exhausting cycle of love, separation, reconciliation, and pain. They divorced, remarried, and divorced again. Through it all, they had 2 children together, Brian and Melanie. Rodney genuinely loved his children, but balancing family life with his emotional struggles and career demands proved difficult. Then tragedy struck. In 1975, Joyce passed away, leaving Rodney to raise the children largely on his own. People often assume comedians live glamorous, carefree lives, but Rodney spent years quietly acting as a devoted father while continuing to perform constantly. For a man who joked endlessly about being a loser, there was a surprising amount of responsibility and loyalty beneath the surface. Still, loneliness followed him everywhere. Then in 1983, something unexpected happened. Rodney walked into a flower shop in Santa Monica and met Joan Child. Unlike many relationships in Hollywood, theirs developed slowly. They dated for nearly a decade before finally marrying in 1993. Joan became far more than Rodney's wife. She became his protector, emotional anchor, and eventually the guardian of his legacy. And by then, Rodney desperately needed stability because his health was beginning to collapse. Rodney lived hard. He smoked constantly. He drank heavily. He relied on marijuana for decades. He openly joked about cigarettes nonstop. At one point he said, "I quit smoking. Toughest thing I ever did. I reward myself every day with a cigarette." It sounded funny, but his body was paying the price. In 2001, during an appearance on The Tonight Show for his 80th birthday celebration, Jay Leno noticed something seemed terribly wrong. Rodney's movements looked off. Paramedics were called while the show was still happening. Rodney had suffered a mild stroke. Yet, unbelievably, he returned to performing again shortly afterward. That's what made Rodney unique. Comedy wasn't just work to him. It was oxygen. But beneath the jokes, something darker was happening emotionally. Rodney battled severe depression for most of his life. In his autobiography, he admitted there were periods where he could barely get out of bed. He described hiding under blankets for days while dark thoughts consumed him. Mood swings, anxiety, and emotional crashes became constant companions. By the end of his life, he reportedly took over 100 pills a day. Imagine that contrast. The world saw a funny celebrity making millions laugh. Meanwhile, privately he was struggling just to function. That disconnect between public laughter and private suffering may explain why so many comedians related to him. Rodney understood pain intimately. And then there were the scandals. One of the most shocking chapters of Rodney's life involved an FBI investigation dating back to the 1950s. During his years away from show business, Rodney became connected to a home repair business accused of defrauding homeowners through deceptive sales schemes. Federal agents conducted raids, and Jack Roy, long before becoming Rodney Dangerfield, was among those indicted. For a while, it looked like his life might completely implode. The charges were eventually dropped, but the damage emotionally and professionally was severe. Rodney desperately needed to escape the shadow of that period. In many ways, becoming Rodney Dangerfield wasn't just a stage reinvention. It was survival. Even after achieving fame, legal battles continued haunting him. In 1988, Rodney suffered an eye injury from a steam bath accident at Caesar's Palace. When the hotel refused to compensate him for missed performances, Rodney sued. The case became ugly.